The prairie stretched before her like an ocean of grass, vast and unforgiving, but Adelaide Thorne faced it with the same defiance she'd shown the town that had cast her out. Her hands, calloused and strong, gripped the worn stock of a rifle that no proper lady should know how to use. They had called her wild, dangerous, unfit for decent company. But on this blood-red evening, as the silhouette of a Lakota warrior appeared at the edge of her homestead, Adelaide would discover that the very skills that had made her an outcast among her own people would make her invaluable to those they feared most. The golden sunset bled across the Dakota Territory like a wound that wouldn't heal, casting long shadows over the solitary cabin that Adelaide had built with her own hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Most women came west with husbands or fathers, but she had come alone, fleeing whispers that clung to her name like burrs. The daughter of a huntsman who'd raised her as if she were the son he never had. Adelaide had never learned to simper or sew or speak only when spoken to. Instead, she could track a deer for miles, hit a target at 300 yards, and survive conditions that had killed men twice her size. Skills that had made her father proud, but had marked her as something unnatural among the townspeople of Riverbend. The evening air carried the scent of sage and coming rain as Adelaide hefted the water bucket from the well. Her arms ached from the day's labor, mending fence posts, smoking the rabbit she'd trapped, and digging a new drainage trench away from the cabin. She'd been on her own for 8 months now, ever since the incident at the Founders' Day social. Mrs. Abernathy had still not forgiven her for knocking out her son's tooth when he'd tried to tame the wild filly, as he'd loudly proclaimed to his friends. The fact that Adelaide had done it with a single precise punch had only confirmed what everyone already whispered, that John Thorne had raised a daughter with no sense of propriety or place. "You'll die alone out here," the Reverend's wife had told her when Adelaide had packed her wagon to leave. "A woman needs protection." "No," Adelaide had replied, checking the action on her Winchester. "A woman needs good aim." Now, as dusk gathered like bruises on the horizon, she surveyed her small plot with a critical eye. The vegetable garden was struggling, but the well hadn't gone dry despite the unseasonably hot spring. Her single horse, Magnus, shifted nervously in the small corral, his ears flicking back and forth. Adelaide set down the bucket and narrowed her eyes, scanning the perimeter of her property. Magnus was a steady animal, not given to fits of nerves unless there was cause. That's when she saw it. A dark shape sprawled in the tall grass near her eastern fence line. At first, she thought it might be a wolf, or perhaps a stray dog. Then she caught the flash of what looked like a human hand. Adelaide froze. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the relations between settlers and the Lakota had deteriorated over the past year as more pioneers pushed into their hunting grounds. Most women would have retreated inside, barred the door, and prayed the shape would disappear by morning. Adelaide was not most women. She set the bucket down slowly, stepped back to the cabin porch, and retrieved her rifle. Not loaded. She wasn't. A fool. But its weight was reassuring as she crossed the open ground toward the fence line. The grass whispered against her canvas trousers, a garment that had scandalized the ladies of Riverbend almost as much as her refusal to marry the widower Hargrove, despite his generous offer to overlook her peculiarities. The figure didn't move as she approached. It was a man, that much was clear now, lying on his side in the deep grass. His black hair was long and loose around shoulders, wrapped in what remained of a buckskin shirt. Lakota, without question. Blood had seeped through the back of his clothing, already darkening to the color of rust in the failing light. One arm was trapped beneath his body, the other stretched toward her property, as if he'd been crawling toward the well. Every story she'd ever heard rushed back to her, about scalping parties and burning homesteads, about women and children carried off, never to be seen again. The newspapers in Riverbend were filled with such accounts, each more lurid than the last. Josephine took a step back, eyes scanning the horizon. No riders, no smoke signals, no war party waiting to ambush her. Just a wounded man bleeding into her soil. She should go back inside, bar the door, wait until morning and ride to Fort Reynolds to report what she'd found. Then he opened his eyes, not fully, not wide, just a sliver of dark beneath heavy lids, glazed with pain but alert enough to find her face. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her. His cracked lips parted slightly, and a sound escaped, a rasp of breath that wasn't even a word, just the raw expression of need that transcends language. Josephine looked at the rifle in her hands, then back at the man. The heft of decision settled in her chest. She could walk away. No one would know, no one would blame her, but she would. The moon had risen by the time she returned with her medical kit and a canteen of fresh water. Kneeling beside him, she set the rifle within reach and slipped an arm under his shoulders, lifting him just enough to bring the canteen to his lips. At first, nothing happened. Then his throat worked and he took a small sip. Another. A tear slid from the corner of one eye, not from pain but from something deeper, something like disbelief. When he finished drinking, she lowered him gently back to the ground and began to assess his wounds. A gunshot, clean through the shoulder, but the exit wound was ugly and beginning to fester. His buckskins were crusted with blood and dirt, his moccasins worn through at the soles. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch adorned with hawk feathers, and intricate tattoos marked his forearms. Symbols she didn't recognize, but that spoke of status, of identity. "This is going to hurt," she said, knowing he probably couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey her meaning. "But I can't leave you out here." It took all her strength to half drag, half carry him to her cabin. He was tall, at least a head taller than her own 5'7" frame, and though lean, his body was dense with muscle. By the time she maneuvered him onto the pallet by her hearth, sweat plastered her shirt to her back, and her arms trembled from exertion. She worked methodically, cutting away his shirt with her hunting knife, cleaning the wound with boiled water, and applying a poultice of yarrow and comfrey that she'd learned to make from an old trapper who'd once wintered in her father's cabin. The Lakota man didn't cry out, though his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. Only once did he grab her wrist, not to stop her, but to endure through connection, his fingers like iron around her bones, until the worst of the pain passed. Adelaide didn't sleep that night. She sat by the small window with her father's old journal open in her lap, the rifle propped against the wall beside her, watching the moon track across the sky. The man's breathing had steadied, but fever had set in despite her efforts. Periodically, she'd rise to place a cool cloth on his forehead or trickle more water between his lips. She didn't know if it would be enough. The bullet had missed his vital organs, but infection was often deadlier than the initial wound. In the dim light of the banked fire, she studied him. He was younger than she'd first thought. Perhaps 25 or 26, not much older than her own 23 years. His features were striking. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and a jaw that spoke of determination, even in unconsciousness. Not a boy, but a warrior. One of those the settlers feared most. What haunted her wasn't just the risk she'd taken, it was the memory that pushed insistently at the edges of her mind. 3 summers ago, when she'd still lived with her father in their cabin near Blackwater Creek, a Lakota hunting party had crossed their land. Most of the neighbors had locked their doors and loaded their guns, but John Thorne had done neither. Instead, he'd shared his tobacco with their leader and traded 2 knives for a fine deerskin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "They're men, Addie," her father had told her afterward. "Just men trying to feed their families same as us. Remember that when I'm gone. He died that winter, pneumonia taking him where no bullet ever could." And in her grief, surrounded by townspeople who had always regarded her as an oddity, Josephine had forgotten his words. Until now, dawn was turning the eastern sky pearl grey when she heard it, the soft but unmistakable sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, many, moving with the deliberate quiet of those who know the land and its secrets. Josephine stood, heart hammering, against her ribs, and peered through the gap in her curtains. They materialized out of the morning mist like apparitions, a dozen riders on paint ponies, their bodies adorned with the same symbols she'd seen tattooed on her patient's arms. Warriors, their faces painted for battle, feathers woven into their braids, weapons ready but not drawn. They formed a silent circle around her cabin and simply sat, watching. Fear crawled up her spine, cold as ice water. Not for herself. Adelaide had made peace with her own mortality long ago, but for what might come next. They wouldn't just kill her. They would burn everything she'd built, erase her presence from this place as if she'd never existed. The wounded man stirred at her feet, mumbling something in his native tongue. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The fever still held him in its grip. Adelaide knelt beside him, pressing another cool cloth to his skin, and his eyes opened fully for the first time. Deep brown, almost black, they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "They're here," she said softly, nodding toward the window. "Your people." A spark of recognition flashed. In his gaze, his hand moved, fingers closing weakly around her wrist again, and he rasped a single word. What it meant, she couldn't say, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Then came a knock at her door, not pounding, not demanding, not the prelude to an attack, just 3 measured raps against the weathered pine boards. The kind of knock that carried authority without needing to announce it, the kind that said, "We know you're inside. We're only asking because we choose to." Adelaide rose slowly, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. A man stood on her porch, older than the others, his hair streaked with silver and braided with intricate beadwork. He wore no war paint, carried no visible weapon save for a hunting knife at his belt, but authority emanated from him like heat from a fire. Around his neck hung an elaborate necklace of bear claws and blue trading beads. His gaze was level, unflinching, taking her measure with a single sweep. He looked past her to where the wounded man lay by the hearth. Something flickered in his face, not relief, not exactly, but perhaps the easing of a terrible certainty. Then he spoke a name, soft but clear. Chayton. The wounded man, Chayton, stirred again, turning his face toward the door. The older man's jaw tightened, not in anger but in something more complex. Something like pride buried beneath years of restraint. He turned back to Adelaide and asked in perfect, if accented, English, "What did you do?" Her mouth went dry. Not, "What have you done to him?" but "What did you do?" As if he already knew. The answer, but needed to hear it from her own lips. "He was dying," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I gave him water, cleaned his wound." A long silence stretched between them. The older man didn't nod, didn't blink, didn't offer thanks or threats. He simply stepped to the side, revealing the circle of mounted warriors beyond her porch. They watched her with expressions that gave nothing away, their stillness more unnerving than any show of weapons. "We will stay here," he said. Josephine frowned. "Why?" He didn't answer. He turned and walked back to his horse, swinging up with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. And just like that, the warriors settled in. They dismounted, secured their ponies, and arranged themselves in a perimeter around her cabin. They lit no fires, raised no voices, made no threatening moves. They simply watched, their eyes like weights on her skin. Adelaide closed the door and leaned against it, legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. She looked at the man on her floor. Chaitin, still fevered, still vulnerable, his life balanced on the knife edge of infection and healing. She had not been thanked, but neither had she been killed. Outside, the soft sounds of horses nickering faded into a silence thick with expectation. They were here now, and they weren't leaving. Adelaide moved to the hearth and stoked the dying embers, adding precious kindling to build the fire anew. She had few supplies, barely enough for herself, let alone for a wounded man and a dozen watchful warriors. But she had made her choice the moment she'd carried water to a dying man, and there was no unmaking it now. As morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting diamonds of dust on the rough-hewn floor, Adelaide rolled up her sleeves and began to prepare a fresh poultice. Whatever came next, whether healing or harm, acceptance or retribution, she would face it as she had faced all the trials of her life, with her chin high, her hands steady, and her father's words echoing in her memory. "They're men, Addie, just men trying to feed their families, same as us. Remember that when I'm gone." And for the first time since she'd found Chaitin bleeding at her fence line, Adelaide felt something like certainty settle in her chest. Not that she would survive this, but that she had done the right thing, the human thing, even if it cost her everything. The second day dawned grey and heavy with unspoken questions. Adelaide moved through her morning tasks with deliberate care, as if each gesture was being weighed and measured. Outside her cabin, the Lakota warriors maintained their silent vigil, neither advancing nor retreating. They had arranged themselves in a perfect circle, each man positioned to see the others and the cabin, an unbroken ring of watchfulness. Adelaide had lived alone for months, without feeling lonely. But this was different. This was isolation under scrutiny. A solitude that came with the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes, tracking her every movement. When she stepped outside to gather firewood from the stack behind her cabin, they turned in unison to follow her progress. Not threatening, just attentive, like crows watching a field for movement. Inside, Chaitin's fever had broken some time before dawn. His skin no longer burned beneath her touch when she changed his bandages, though the wound was still an angry red. His strength was returning in small measures. He could sit up with assistance, could drink water without choking, could stay awake for longer periods, but he didn't speak. Not to her, not even to himself in his native tongue. He simply watched her with eyes that missed nothing, his face a mask of dignified patience. "You should eat," Adelaide said, offering him a bowl of thin rabbit broth with the last of her dried corn. "You need your strength." He accepted the bowl without comment, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. A contact that felt like, and question neither of them knew how to ask. Midday brought a shift in the circle outside. 3 of the warriors rode away toward the southeast, moving with purpose. Adelaide watched them go from her window, a knot forming in her stomach. What were they seeking? Reinforcements, weapons, or perhaps just food for the others? The older man, she still didn't know his name, remained seated on a flat rock near her garden, whittling something with methodical precision. His silver-streaked hair caught the weak sunlight, and occasionally he would glance up to meet her gaze through the window. He never nodded, never gestured, just acknowledged her presence with the calm assurance of someone who had all the time in the world. By late afternoon, Adelaide's practical concerns began to override her uncertainty. Her provisions were limited, and while she had planned for lean times, she hadn't accounted for feeding a wounded man and his guardians. She had been saving seeds for her garden, had carefully measured out her flour and salt, to last until she could make it to the trading post in 2 weeks' time. Now those calculations were meaningless. "I need to hunt," she said aloud to herself, but also to Chaitin, who was awake and sitting up against the wall, his good arm cradling his injured one. "We need food." He said nothing, but his eyes tracked. Her, as she pulled her father's old hunting knife from its sheath and tested the edge against her thumb. She had bullets for the rifle, not many, but enough, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. She hadn't loaded the weapon yet, uncertain how the warriors outside would react to seeing her emerge armed. "They won't stop you," Chayton said, his voice startling her with its unexpected depth. His English was accented but clear, each word precise, as if chosen with care. Adelaide turned to face him, her heart quickening. "You speak English?" It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "I was taken to the white man's school when I was a boy." A shadow crossed his face. "For 3 winters." The statement held volumes, stories of separation, of being forced into strange clothes and stranger ways, of punishment for speaking his own language. Adelaide had heard whispers of such schools, well-meaning missionaries and government agents, who believed they were saving souls while breaking spirits. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt inadequate. Chayton's expression didn't change. "It is the past." Then he nodded toward the window. "My uncle will not stop you from hunting, but he will watch." "Your uncle?" Adelaide repeated. "The older man." "Hota," Chayton said, the name flowing from his lips like water over stones. "He is chief of our band." Adelaide absorbed this information, its weight settling in her chest. Not just any Lakota had found his way to her fence line, but the nephew of a chief. The implications unfurled in her mind like a map whose territories were all marked with warnings. Why did they come? She asked, the question that had been building since she first saw them materialize out of the morning mist. Chayton's eyes held hers. "They followed my trail. I was to return 3 days ago." "You were shot?" "Yes. By settlers." A pause, then, "by those who wish us gone." The distinction might have seemed meaningless to another, but Adelaide understood. Not all whites wanted conflict, just as not all Lakota sought war. But there were those on both sides who saw blood as the only path forward. "What happened?" she asked. Chayton's jaw tightened. "I was scouting. There are men building where they should not build, on land promised to us." His voice took on an edge. "I was seen." The reservation boundaries were contested and constantly shifting, with treaties made and broken faster than the ink could dry. Adelaide had heard talk in Riverbend about new settlements, pushing farther into what had once been designated Indian territory, about ranchers claiming water rights to springs the Lakota had used for generations. Will there be war? The question was blunt, but Adelaide had never been one to soften her words. Chayton didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to the door, beyond which his people waited. "There is always war," he said finally. "Sometimes with bullets, sometimes with papers, sometimes with schools that teach us to forget our own names." Adelaide nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. She too knew something about being told to forget who you were, to become something more acceptable to others. "I still need to hunt," she said, returning to the practical concern that had started their conversation. "If they're staying, we need food." "They brought their own," Chayton said. "But yes, hunt. It will answer a question for them." "What question?" His expression remained unreadable. "Whether you are afraid." Adelaide considered this as she pulled on her worn buckskin jacket, another item that had raised eyebrows in town, as it was clearly made in the Lakota style, traded from a passing band years ago. "I've been afraid every day since I found you," she admitted. But fear never fed anyone. For the first time, something like approval flickered in Chayton's eyes. When she stepped outside with her rifle, loaded now, but held pointed at the ground, the circle of warriors shifted, not dispersing, not threatening, just adjusting their positions to accommodate her movement. Hota rose from his rock, tucking his whittling knife into his belt, and approached her with the same measured pace as before. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze dropping to the rifle in her hands, then returning to her face. "You hunt," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Adelaide replied. "For food." He studied her for a long moment, then made a small gesture with one hand. One of the younger warriors detached himself from the group and approached, leading his pony. Hotar spoke to him in rapid Lakota, too quick for Adelaide to catch even a single word. The young man nodded, swung onto his mount, and positioned himself near the edge of her property, clearly waiting. "Akacheta will go with you," Hotar said. Adelaide bristled. "I don't need an escort." "Not escort," Hotar replied, his expression unchanged. "Witness," the word hung between them, heavy with implications. Whatever was happening here, it was more than a vigil for a wounded warrior. It was some kind of test, some kind of judgment, and every action she took was being added to an invisible ledger. "Fine," she said, adjusting the strap of her ammunition pouch, "but tell him to stay downwind. I won't come back empty-handed because he's scared off the game." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Hotar's eyes. There and gone so quickly, Adelaide wondered if she'd imagined it. He spoke again to Akacheta, who nodded once. Adelaide set off toward the creek that ran along the western edge of her property, where she'd had luck with deer before. Akacheta followed at a distance, his pony's hooves nearly silent on the soft earth. The weight of the rifle in her hands was reassuring, a connection to her father and the skills he'd taught her when other girls her age were learning to embroider pillowcases. The land opened before her, vast and indifferent to the human, dramas playing out upon it. Prairie grass swayed in the breeze, dotted with early spring wildflowers. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, hunting for its own meal. Adelaide moved with practiced silence, her steps light despite her sturdy build. Behind her, Akacheta matched, her pace keeping the same distance between them, neither closing the gap nor falling behind. Near the creek, Adelaide slowed, crouching low in the grass. Fresh tracks marked the mud along the bank. Deer had come to drink recently, probably at dawn. She studied the patterns, noting the direction they had taken afterward, toward a small copse of cottonwoods that offered shelter from the wind. Adelaide glanced back at Akacheta, who had stopped his pony and was watching her with the same impassive expression all the warriors seemed to share. She gestured toward the trees, indicating her intention, and he nodded once. Whether he understood her hunting strategy or was simply acknowledging her direction, she couldn't tell. She made her way toward the cottonwoods, moving in a wide arc to approach from downwind. The breeze carried the scent of water and green things. Growing, but beneath it she caught the musky odor of deer. They were close. At the edge of the trees, Adelaide paused, rifle ready. Her pulse was steady, her breathing controlled. This was the moment her father had taught her to savor. Not the kill itself, but the perfect alignment of hunter and prey, of need and opportunity, of life and death in their ancient dance. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Tawny hide against pale bark, a young buck, not fully grown but large enough to feed them for several days. He stepped delicately between the trees, head raised, testing the air. Adelaide raised her rifle with fluid grace, sighting along the barrel. The buck froze, sensing danger but unable to locate it. Adelaide exhaled slowly, finger curling around. The trigger, the shot cracked through the stillness like thunder. The buck dropped instantly, a clean kill. Adelaide lowered her rifle, a prayer of thanks on her lips, not to the Christian God she'd been taught to worship in town, but to the spirit of the deer that would feed them, to the land that provided, to the cycle that connected them all. She glanced back toward Akacheta, expecting to see him still mounted, still watching. Instead, he had dismounted and was approaching on foot, leading his pony. His expression had changed, subtle but unmistakable. There was respect there now, maybe even approval. He stopped beside her, looking down at the fallen deer. Then he spoke, his English halting but clear. "You hunt like Lakota woman, not afraid of blood." Adelaide wasn't sure if it was a compliment or merely an observation. "Blood is just blood," she said. "Everything that lives must eat." Akecheta studied her for a moment longer, then drew his knife, a gesture that might have alarmed her days ago, but now seemed natural. "I help carry," he said. Together they field-dressed the deer with efficient movements. Adelaide was surprised to find that they worked well together, anticipating each other's actions without need for words. When the task was complete, Akecheta helped her load the deer across his pony's back, the animal standing patiently throughout the process. On the walk back to the cabin, something shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition. Two hunters who understood the language of survival, two outsiders who knew what it meant to move through a world that sought to confine them to smaller spaces than they required. The other warriors watched their approach, and Adelaide felt the weight of their collective gaze. Hotar stood from his rock once more, observing the deer draped across the pony, the blood on Adelaide's hands, the easy way she carried herself despite the morning's effort. "Good hunting," he said as they drew near. Adelaide nodded. "Enough for all if you wish to share." Again, that flicker of something in his eyes. Not quite approval, not quite amusement, but a recognition of sorts. He spoke to Akecheta in Lakota, and the younger man responded with a few quick words, gesturing toward Adelaide with what seemed like respect. Hotar turned back to her. "You have skill," he said. "Who taught you?" "My father," Adelaide replied. "He had no sons. He said a daughter with a rifle eats better than a son with dreams." Hotar's expression softened slightly. "Wise man." "He's dead now," Adelaide said, the familiar ache of loss rising in her chest. "Fever took him 3 winters ago." "Yet he lives," Hotar said, gesturing toward the deer, toward the rifle in her hands, toward Adelaide herself. "In what he gave you." The observation struck her with unexpected force. In Riverbend, her father's legacy had been seen as a stain, an improper upbringing that had rendered her unsuitable for polite society. Here, under the open sky, it was recognized as a gift, a strength, a way of honoring the dead by using what they had taught. Adelaide swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "Yes," she said simply, "he does." As the afternoon wore on, an unexpected cooperation developed. 2 of the warriors built a proper fire pit near the edge of Adelaide's garden, while others brought wood. Akecheta and another young man she didn't know began preparing the deer, separating the meat for immediate cooking from portions that would be dried for later use. Adelaide brought out her precious store of salt, offering it for the preservation process. Inside the cabin, Chayton had managed to stand, leaning heavily against the wall. When Adelaide entered to check on him, she found him looking out the window at the activity in the yard, his expression unreadable. "They've accepted your offering," he said quietly. Adelaide set down the clean bandages she'd brought. "It wasn't an offering. It was practical. We all need to eat." Chayton turned to face her. "To my people, sharing food is never just practical. It is a bond." She considered this as she helped him sit on the edge of her narrow bed, his movements still stiff with pain. "I don't understand what's happening here," she admitted. "Why they stay, why they watch, what they want from me." Chayton was silent. For a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. Then he said, "They are trying to decide what kind of spirit you have." "Spirit? Among my people, a person's spirit is more important than their actions. Actions can be forced. Spirit cannot." Adelaide frowned. "I was taught that actions are what matter. By their fruits ye shall know them." "The white man's God looks only at what is done," Chayton said. "My people look at why it is done." Outside, voices rose and fell in a language Adelaide couldn't understand, punctuated by the crackling of the fire. The scent of roasting meat drifted through the open window, rich and promising. Her stomach tightened with hunger. She had not eaten since the previous night, her meager breakfast having gone to Chaitan's recovery. "And what have they decided?" she asked, nodding toward the window, toward the warriors beyond. "About my spirit?" Chaitan's eyes held hers, dark and fathomless. "They have not decided yet, but the hunt today, it was good. Honoring the deer, sharing the meat, these things speak." Adelaide moved to the basin on her small table, washing the blood and dirt from her hands with water she couldn't afford to waste. "I'm not trying to impress them," she said, her voice low. "I'm just trying to survive, same as anyone. That," Chaitan said quietly, "is why they begin to respect you. You do not perform, you simply are." The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unexpected. All her life, Adelaide had been told she was wrong, too bold, too strong, too independent, too much herself, and not enough of what a woman should be. She had never fit into the narrow confines of what Riverbend deemed acceptable, had never managed to soften her edges to please those around her. And here, surrounded by those who should have been her enemies, she was being seen, truly seen, without the distorting lens of expectation that had colored every interaction in town. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Hotar appeared at her door. He knocked once, not demanding entrance but requesting it. Adelaide opened the door, conscious of Chaitan's presence behind her, of the rifle leaning against the wall, of the increasingly complex dance they were all performing around one another. Hotar held out a wooden bowl filled with cooked venison, tender and glistening with its own juices. A peace offering, a gesture of respect, a recognition of her contribution. Adelaide accepted it with both hands, the proper way to receive a gift, though she couldn't have said how she knew this. "Eat," Hotar said. "Then we will talk." Adelaide nodded, understanding that whatever came next would shape everything that followed. The circle was tightening, the watching eyes drawing closer, the judgment, whatever it might be, approaching with the inevitability of night following day. She took the bowl from Hotar's weathered hands, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. A connection made, a circuit completed. Behind her, Chaitan shifted, his presence a reminder of how this strange convergence had begun, with a wounded man and a choice made in the growing darkness. Outside, the fire burned higher as twilight gathered around the cabin. The shadows of the warriors stretched long across her yard, merging with the encroaching night. Adelaide stood in the doorway between two worlds, holding the bowl of venison in hands that had hunted and healed with equal skill, waiting for whatever would come next. The stars emerged like pinpricks in the indigo canvas of night, countless and cold in their ancient vigil. Adelaide sat on her porch step, the empty wooden bowl beside her, waiting for Hotar to speak. The chief had positioned himself on a smooth stone across from her, close enough for conversation, but with space enough for dignity. Behind him, the fire cast his shadow long and fluid across the packed earth of the yard. The other warriors had withdrawn to a respectful distance, forming a half-circle that enclosed them without crowding. Their voices were low murmurs, a river of sound in a language Adelaide couldn't understand, but their attention remained fixed on the tableau before them, the white woman and the Lakota chief, measuring each other in the firelight. "You live alone," Hotar said finally, his statement carrying the weight of both observation and question. "No husband, no father, no brother." Adelaide nodded. "By choice. A dangerous choice. Perhaps," she acknowledged. But the alternative was worse. Hotar's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite his years, studied her with renewed interest. What alternative? Adelaide looked past him to the fire, to the men gathered beyond. Men who, according to everything she'd been taught in Riverbend, should represent her greatest fear. Yet here she sat, more at ease than she'd felt in the suffocating parlors of so-called civilization. To live as something I'm not, she said finally, to pretend I'm weaker than I am, smaller, less. Hotar nodded slowly. This I understand. He gestured toward the cabin where Chaitan rested. My sister's son, he went to the white man's school. They tried to make him forget who he was, cut his hair, changed his name. Something like anger flickered in his eyes, quickly banked. He came back knowing your words but hating himself. Adelaide felt a pang of recognition. And now? Now he is our eyes, Hotar said. He walks between worlds, understands the ways of the white man, but remembers the ways of the Lakota. A scout, Adelaide realized. Not just any scout, but one uniquely equipped to navigate the increasingly complicated boundary between two peoples. No wonder his uncle had come with so many warriors when he went missing. Chaitan wasn't just family, he was invaluable. Why did you help him? Hotar asked, the question she had been waiting for since he first appeared at her door. You could have let him die. Many of your people would have. Adelaide considered her answer carefully, aware that more than curiosity lay behind his words. My father taught me that a person in need is just a person in need. Not a threat, not an enemy, just someone who might not see tomorrow without help. A good teaching, Hotar said, but rare among your kind. Rare among any kind, Adelaide countered. Fear makes people cruel, whether they're white or Lakota or anything else. Hotar's expression shifted subtly, a fleeting acknowledgement of a truth recognized. He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something small, holding it cupped in his palm. When Chaitan did not return, I consulted our medicine man. He performed a ceremony to find my sister's son. He opened his hand, revealing a small, smooth stone marked with a red spiral. The stone showed a woman standing between death and life. A woman who was not afraid of blood or pain. A woman with the spirit of a warrior, but hands that heal. Adelaide stared at the stone, a chill running through her despite the fire's warmth. And you believe that woman was me? The stone does not lie, Hotar said simply. But men do. So we came to see for ourselves. He closed his fingers around the stone. Once more, 3 days we have watched, how you care for him, how you face us without fear, how you hunt with respect for the deer spirit. He tucked the stone back into his pouch. You are not what we expected. Before Adelaide could respond, movement from the cabin drew their attention. Chaitan stood in the doorway, one hand braced, against the frame for support, his face drawn with the effort of standing, but his eyes clear and determined. He spoke in Lakota, his voice carrying across the yard despite its softness. The warriors straightened, turning toward him with expressions of surprise and what Adelaide thought might be relief. Hotar rose from his stone, answering Chaitan in the same language, his tone questioning. Chaitan replied, gesturing toward Adelaide, with his good arm, then switched to English, clearly intending her to understand. She does not deserve judgment, he said. She deserves gratitude. Hotar's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle relaxing of tension. Is this your blood speaking, or your spirit? Both, Chaitan replied without hesitation. I would have died without her care. Many would have left me to the wolves from fear or hatred. And if she had done it to claim you, Hotar asked, to make you owe her, to use you against your own people. Adelaide bristled at the suggestion, but Chaitan answered before she could speak. Then she would not have given me her bed while she slept on the floor, would not have used the last of her medicine on my wound, would not have hunted to feed us all when she could have hidden inside. His eyes met Adelaide's across the yard. She helped me because it was right, no other reason. A long silence followed his words, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Then Hotar nodded once, decision made. He turned back to Adelaide. Tomorrow we leave. Chayton will come with us, to heal among his own people. Adelaide felt a curious twist in her chest, relief mixed with something that felt inexplicably like loss. Of course, she said, he should be with his family. But first, Hotar continued, we will help you prepare for what comes next. Adelaide frowned. What do you mean? Hotar's expression was grave. The men who shot Chayton, they have been moving closer to these lands, building where they should. Not build, taking what is not theirs to take. He glanced around her small homestead. They will come here eventually. The chill that had started with the stone deepened, spreading through Adelaide's limbs. How do you know? Because this place lies between their new settlement and the water they seek to control, Chayton said from the doorway, his voice tight, with suppressed pain. I was scouting their camp when they found me. They are many, with many guns. Adelaide thought of her solitary existence, her limited ammunition, her vulnerable position. How many? 15 men, Chayton replied. Maybe. More by now. They call themselves the Territorial Improvement Company. Adelaide had heard whispers of such operations in Riverbend. Land speculators and opportunists who used quasi-legal means to claim territory, often backed by Eastern money and questionable government contracts. They operated in the grey spaces, between formal settlement and lawlessness, wielding influence like a weapon. What will they want with my land? She asked. It's not much. It is not your land they want, Hotar said. It is the creek that runs through it, the water, for their cattle and their operations. Water rights, of course. In the Dakota Territory, water meant life, meant power, meant control. Her small creek fed into the larger river system that sustained both settler communities and Lakota hunting. Grounds. Whoever controlled its flow held leverage over everything downstream. When will they come? She asked, practical concerns overshadowing the larger political implications. Soon, Chayton said. Days, perhaps. A week at most. Adelaide stood, brushing dust from her trousers. Then I'd best be ready for them. Hotar studied her with new intensity. You would stay, alone, against so many? This is my home, Adelaide said simply. I built it with my own hands. I won't abandon it to thieves, no matter what paper they wave or what authority they claim. A murmur ran through the gathered warriors, and even in the language barrier, Adelaide recognized approval in their tones. Hotar and Chayton exchanged a look laden with meaning, a silent communication that spoke of decisions being weighed. Wahan, one of the older warriors said, the word carrying across the night air like smoke. Others nodded, repeating it softly. What does that mean? Adelaide asked. It means sacred, Chayton translated, or mysterious, someone who carries power. Adelaide shook her head. I'm neither of those things, I'm just stubborn. Something, like a smile, touched Hotar's lips, there and gone in an instant. Sometimes they are the same thing. He turned to the gathered warriors and spoke in rapid Lakota. They dispersed immediately, moving with purpose toward their horses and their modest camp at the edge of her property. Rest, Hotar told Adelaide. Tomorrow we prepare. Left alone on her porch, Adelaide felt the events of the day settle over her like a heavy blanket. The hunt, the shared meal, the conversation laden with judgments and revelations, and now the warning of danger approaching. Men who would take what wasn't theirs because they believed their desires outweighed her rights. Men not so different from those who had driven her from Riverbend with their narrow expectations and unwelcome advances. Inside the cabin, Chayton had returned to his place by the hearth, his strength visibly depleted by the effort of standing. For so long, Adelaide lit the oil lamp, its warm glow softening the rough edges of her home. You should have told me about the danger sooner, she said, not accusingly, but matter-of-factly. Chayton looked up at her. Would it have changed what you did? Helping me? Adelaide considered the question honestly. No, she admitted. but I might have started planning sooner. My uncle needed to decide about you first, Chaitan said, to know whether you could be trusted. And now? Now he believes what I already knew. His dark eyes held hers in the lamplight. That you are not like the others. Adelaide turned away, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze, with the implicit compliment in his words. I'm going to check the rifle, she said, moving toward the corner where her weapons were stored. Clean the pistol too. Chaitan watched her methodical movements as she disassembled her father's Colt Navy revolver, her hands sure and practiced as she cleaned each component. You handle it well, he observed, like you were born to it. My father taught me when I was 12, Adelaide said, not looking up from her work, said if I was going to live in this world, I needed to understand its dangers and how to face them. She reassembled the pistol with quick efficiency. The ladies in town thought it was scandalous, said he was turning me into a savage. The irony of the word struck her now, sitting across from a man those same ladies would have fled from in terror. What is a savage? Chaitan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer all too well. Someone who knows how to survive? Someone who doesn't pretend the world is safer than it is. Adelaide met his gaze then. Someone who doesn't fit into the neat little box others have prepared for them. Understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared experience despite the vast differences in their backgrounds. Both had been judged for refusing to become less than they were, for insisting on their right to exist on their own terms. Get some rest, Adelaide said, rising to her feet. Your uncle is right. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Morning arrived with purpose, the sun barely cresting the horizon when activity began around the cabin. Adelaide emerged to find the warriors, already in motion, some tending to the horses, others constructing something near the edge of her garden, a series of wooden frames that made no immediate sense to her. Hotar approached as she filled her water bucket at the well. Your fence is weak, he said without preamble. We will strengthen it. Adelaide glanced toward the crude split-rail fence that marked her property's boundary. It had been hastily constructed when she first arrived, more to define her space than to defend it. Thank you, she said, the words feeling inadequate for the unexpected aid. Throughout the morning, the Lakota worked with focused efficiency. They reinforced her fence with sharpened stakes, driven into the ground at angles that would deter both men and horses. They constructed simple but effective barriers that could be quickly positioned to channel approaching riders into predetermined paths. Two of the younger warriors cleared the sightlines around the cabin, ensuring no one could approach unseen. Adelaide worked alongside them, following Hotar's directions without question. Her hands blistered and her muscles ached, but a curious energy sustained her, a sense of purpose that transcended the physical discomfort. By midday, her small homestead had been transformed from a vulnerable outpost to a defensible position. During a brief rest, as they shared water and dried meat in the shade of the cottonwood tree near her garden, Akacheta approached Adelaide. The young warrior who had accompanied her hunting now held himself differently around her, with a respect that bordered on deference. You fight before? He asked, his English halting but clear. Adelaide shook her head. Not like this, not against so many. Akacheta nodded thoughtfully. Then he reached to his belt and drew a knife, not his hunting blade, but a smaller one with an intricately carved handle of antler. He held it out to her, handle first. For clothes, he said simply, if they come too near. Adelaide accepted the knife, feeling its perfect balance in her palm. It was beautiful but functional, the blade razor-sharp and slightly curved for maximum effect. A warrior's weapon passed to her with solemn ceremony. Thank you, she said, the weight of the gesture not lost on her. Akacheta touched 2 fingers to his chest, then extended them toward her, a gesture she didn't understand but recognized as significant. Strong heart, he said, like Lakota woman. As the afternoon progressed, Chaitan emerged from the cabin, moving slowly, but with growing steadiness. His color had improved, and the fever had not returned. He watched the preparations with a critical eye, occasionally offering suggestions in Lakota to his kinsman. When he approached Adelaide, his gait was still stiff, but no longer halting. "You should come with us," he said without preamble. "When we leave, it would be safer." Adelaide paused in her task of filling cartridges with precious gunpowder and "Lead." "I can't." "Why?" The directness of his question matched her own typical manner of speaking. "Because it is your land. Land can be found elsewhere. Life cannot be replaced." Adelaide's hands stilled completely. "It's not about the land," she said slowly, realizing the truth of her words as she spoke them. "It's about not running. Again." Chaitan's expression softened. "You have run before." It wasn't a question, but Adelaide answered anyway. "From Riverbend, from the whispers and the judgment and the constant pressure to be less than I am." She resumed her careful measuring of powder. "If I run from this, I'll never stop running. There will always be men who think they can take what they want, because I'm alone, because I'm a woman, because I don't matter." Chaitan was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Among my people," he said finally, "the strongest warriors are not those who win every battle. They are those who know why they fight." He glanced around at the preparations, at the warriors who had spent the day helping a white woman fortify her home against other white men. "You know why you fight. That makes you dangerous." As evening approached, Hota called the warriors together. They gathered in a circle near the fire pit, their faces solemn in the fading light. He spoke to them in Lakota, his words carrying the unmistakable cadence of formal address. Adelaide stood at a respectful distance, aware that she was witnessing something not meant for outsiders, yet not excluded from it either. When Hota finished speaking, each warrior approached him one by one. He placed his hand on each man's shoulder, spoke a few quiet words, and then they moved away to prepare for departure. Lastly, Chaitan stood before his uncle, still favoring his injured arm, but standing tall. Their exchange was longer, more intense, punctuated by glances in Adelaide's direction. Finally, Hota approached her, his expression as unreadable as it had been the first time he appeared at her door. But something had changed. A shift in how he carried himself, in how he looked at her, not as a curiosity or a potential threat, but as a person worthy of regard. "3 will stay," he said, gesturing toward Akasheta and 2 other warriors, both older men with the weathered faces of those who had seen many seasons. "To help when the bad men come." Adelaide's surprise must have shown on her face, for Hota continued, "You saved my sister's son. This debt cannot be paid with words or trinkets." "There is no debt," Adelaide said. "I did what anyone should have done." Hota's expression didn't change, but something like respect flickered in his eyes. "That is why there is a debt," he said simply, "because you believe there is not." He reached into his pouch and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft buckskin. "For your protection," he said, placing it in her palm. Adelaide unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside lay a stone amulet on a leather cord, carved with the same spiral symbol he had shown her the night before. "I don't understand," she said, looking up at him. "It is Wakan," Hota explained. "Sacred. It will help the spirits recognize you as a friend to the Lakota." He nodded toward the 3 warriors who would remain. "They will see you through what comes, then they will guide you to our winter camp if you wish it." The implication hung in the air between them, an invitation unprecedented and unexpected. Not just safe passage through Lakota territory, but the possibility of shelter among them, a place where her strength might be valued rather than feared, where her differences might be seen as gifts rather than flaws. "Why?" Adelaide asked, unable to keep the question contained. "Why help me like this?" Hota's gaze was steady. Because the stone showed a woman between worlds. Not just between life and death, but between your people and mine. He gestured toward the amulet in her hand. Such a one is rare. Such a one may be needed in the days to come, when the boundaries between our worlds grow thinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, the main party of Lakota prepared to depart. Chayton, deemed strong enough to ride if supported, was helped onto a gentle mare. Before mounting his own horse, he approached Adelaide one last time. "Stay alert," he said. "The men who shot me, they do not see what is before them, only what they wish to take." Adelaide nodded. "I'll be careful." Chayton studied her face as if committing it to memory. "When this is done," he said quietly, "if you wish it, I will return." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Not a declaration, not even a promise, just a possibility, offered without expectation or demand. A door left open between them, between their separate worlds. "I would welcome that," Adelaide said, surprising herself with her honesty. As the Lakota riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, their forms melding with the shadows of the prairie, Adelaide stood on her porch with the stone amulet around her neck and 3 warriors maintaining a watchful vigil at the edges of her property. The preparations were complete. The warnings had been given. All that remained was to wait for the approaching storm, men who sought to take what was not theirs, who would find instead a woman who had finally stopped running. Adelaide touched the spiral stone at her throat, feeling its smooth coolness against her skin. Between worlds, Hota had called her, not fully belonging to either but capable of moving between them. Perhaps that was not a weakness, but a strength, just as her father's unconventional teachings had prepared her for this moment when traditional womanhood would have left her defenseless. As night settled fully over the prairie, Adelaide lit the lamp in her window, not as a beacon of welcome, but as a declaration. "I am here. I am watching. I am ready." 3 days passed with the deceptive peace of a held breath. Adelaide settled into a watchful routine with the 3 Lakota warriors who remained: Akecheta, the youngest and most agile; Mahka, an older man, with a scar that ran from temple to jaw; and Hanska, broad-shouldered and solemn, who spoke no English but communicated through gestures more eloquent than words. They maintained a rotation, one always keeping watch from the small rise beyond her garden, while the others helped strengthen the homestead's defenses or hunted for additional food. They slept outside, despite Adelaide's offer of the cabin floor, preferring the open sky and the freedom to move quickly if needed. On the morning of the 4th day, Akecheta returned from scouting with news in his eyes before he spoke a word. "They come," he said simply, dismounting in a fluid motion. "From south, many horses, many guns." Adelaide felt a curious calm settle over her, like the stillness that precedes a lightning strike. "How many?" 12 men, Akecheta replied. 2 wagons, 1 day's ride, maybe less." Maka approached, his weathered face creased with concern. He spoke rapidly to Akecheta in Lakota, who nodded and translated for Adelaide. "He says they bring supplies, not just passing through. They come to stay." The implication was clear. This was no random encounter, no simple group of travelers. These men had intention, had purpose that centered on this land and its water. "How much time do we have?" Adelaide asked, already mentally inventorying her ammunition, her provisions, the vulnerabilities in their defenses. "They camp tonight at Split Oak Creek," Akecheta said. "Here tomorrow before midday. Less than 24 hours. Not much time, but enough if they used it wisely." Adelaide nodded. Decision made. "Then we prepare." Throughout the day, they worked. Without pause, fueled by the certainty of what approached, the warriors rolled large stones to strategic positions that could provide cover in a firefight. Adelaide dug shallow trenches near likely approach points, not deep enough to be obvious, but sufficient to trip a running man or slow a charging horse. Hanska, who had revealed himself to be skilled with knives, fashioned crude but effective caltrops. From scrap metal and wood, twisted spikes that could pierce a horse's hoof or a man's boot if stepped on. These they scattered in the tall grass along the most direct routes to the cabin. As dusk gathered, they congregated around a small fire, keeping it low to avoid betraying their position. Adelaide cleaned her revolver one final time, the familiar ritual soothing her nerves. Akecheta watched her hands move over the weapon with practiced ease. "You not afraid?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Adelaide considered the question honestly. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "but fear doesn't help. It just wastes energy I need for thinking." Akecheta nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. Lakota warrior feels fear too, but uses it like fire. He gestured to the flames between them. "Can warm you or burn your enemy. Depends how you control it." Maka spoke then, his English broken but understandable when he chose to use it. "Woman with gun, good. Woman with plan, better." He tapped his temple significantly. "Fight here first." Then his chest. Then here. Finally he raised his hands as if holding a weapon. "Then here. This order." Adelaide understood. Victory began, with strategy, was fueled by courage, and was only then executed with weapons, an approach her father would have approved of wholeheartedly. "Why do you help me?" she asked suddenly, the question that had lingered unspoken since Hota had announced 3 would stay. "This isn't your fight." Maka and Akecheta exchanged a glance, communicating in that silent language of those who have fought together before. Then Maka spoke, his scarred face solemn in the firelight. "Water runs, belongs to no one. These men want to own what Great Spirit made for all." He gestured toward Adelaide's cabin, her garden, her modest homestead. "You take what you need. They take everything." It was the most she had heard him speak at once, and the words resonated with her own unformed thoughts. This wasn't just about her property, her right to remain. It was about something larger, about greed versus sufficiency, about taking only what you needed versus consuming without limit. "There is something else," Akecheta added. "Chaitan said, you have medicine woman spirit, hidden but strong, such spirit rare now, worth protecting." Adelaide frowned, uncomfortable with the attribution of mystical qualities. "I'm not a medicine woman. I just know some herbs, some treatments my father taught me." Akecheta shrugged, undeterred. "Spirit doesn't always know itself." He touched the spiral amulet that still hung at her throat. "Others see before you do." That night, Adelaide slept fitfully, waking at every slight sound. The rustle of prairie, grass in the breeze, the distant cry of coyotes hunting under the moon, the soft footfalls of Hanska as he changed watch with Maka. Her dreams were fragmented, filled with running figures and the crack of gunfire, with Chaitan's dark eyes watching her across impossible distances. She rose before dawn, her body tense with anticipation. After splashing cold water on her face, from the basin she dressed with deliberate care. Practical canvas trousers, a faded flannel shirt, sturdy boots, her father's old leather vest with pockets for extra ammunition. Her hair, usually braided simply down her back, she coiled tightly at her nape, securing it with pins to keep it from becoming a handhold for an enemy. When she stepped outside, Akecheta was waiting, his expression grave. "They move early," he said without preamble. "Breaking camp now. We'll be here sooner than we thought." Adelaide nodded, adjusting the revolver at her hip. "Then so will we." They finalized their strategy over a hasty breakfast of cold venison and hard bread. The plan was simple but sound. Let the men approach, observe their intentions before revealing their own strength. If the newcomers proved peaceful, unlikely as that seemed, confrontation could be avoided. If not, they would fight from prepared positions, using the advantage of surprise. No first shot, Maka instructed firmly. Let them show hand. Adelaide agreed. She had no desire for bloodshed, but neither would she be driven from her home by threats or intimidation. If these men wanted her land, her water, they would have to take it, and she would make that cost dearly. The sun had barely cleared the eastern horizon when Hanska gave the signal. 3 short whistles like a meadowlark, natural enough to avoid. Suspicion, but distinctive enough to carry meaning. The men were approaching, still about a mile out, but moving steadily. Adelaide positioned herself on the porch, rifle within reach but not in hand, presenting the image of a solitary woman going about her morning chores. The warriors concealed themselves. Akasheta in the root cellar behind the cabin, with a clear view of the approach, Maka among the cottonwoods near the creek, and Hanska in the shallow depression near the garden, all with weapons ready but hidden. Through her father's old spyglass, Adelaide watched the approaching party with a critical eye. 12 men, as Akacheta had reported, dressed in the rough garb of frontiersmen, but with an organization that spoke of something more than random settlers. They moved in formation, led by a man on a sorrel stallion who carried himself with the unconscious authority of command. Behind them came 2 wagons loaded with supplies, further confirmation that they intended to establish a lasting presence. As they drew nearer, Adelaide could make out details. Most carried rifles, some had sidearms as well. Their faces were hard, weathered by sun and wind, and the particular callousness that comes from viewing land as something to be conquered rather than lived with. Not soldiers, but men accustomed to getting their way through force when necessary. When they were within 100 yards, the leader raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt. He studied the cabin, the garden, the modest corral where her horse grazed with deliberate unconcern. His gaze settled on Adelaide, and even at this distance, she could feel the dismissive assessment. Just a woman, alone, and therefore vulnerable. How wrong he was. The leader spurred his horse forward, approaching at a walk with 2 men flanking him slightly behind. A show of confidence, of control. Adelaide remained where she was, one hand resting casually near her waist, where Akacheta's gift knife was sheathed, closer and faster to draw than the revolver if needed. "Good morning, ma'am," the leader called as he drew rein about 20 feet. In from her porch, close enough for conversation, far enough to react if threatened, a careful distance that told Adelaide this man had experience with potentially hostile encounters. "Didn't expect to find anyone out this way." His tone was friendly. Enough, but his eyes were cold, assessing everything with the calculation of a man tallying assets and obstacles. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 50, with a close-trimmed silver beard and the ruddy complexion of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. His clothes were of better quality than his companions, and a gold watch chain glinted against his vest. "This is my land," Adelaide replied, her voice steady and carrying. "Has been for 8 months now, registered with the territorial office in Bismarck." The man smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. "Is that so? All alone out here? That's mighty brave for a young lady." The condescension in his tone made her skin crawl, but Adelaide kept her expression neutral. "I manage." "I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do." He removed his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "Colonel James Blackwood, ma'am, of the Territorial Improvement Company. These are my associates, Mr. Reed and Mr. Decker." He indicated the men beside him, who nodded without warmth. "We're surveying the area for development opportunities. Progress, you know. Bringing civilization to the wilderness." The practiced speech rang hollow, especially coming from men whose civilization seemed to consist mainly of firearms and hard expressions. But it was the name that caught Adelaide's attention, sending a chill down her spine. Blackwood, the same surname as her own father, not a common name in these parts, which meant Any relation to John Blackwood of Riverbend? She asked, keeping her voice casual though her heart raced. Something flickered in the colonel's eyes. Recognition, calculation, a momentary uncertainty quickly masked. My younger brother, he said after a slight pause, though we weren't close these past years. You knew him? Adelaide felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. This man, this taker of lands and water, was her uncle, her father's estranged brother, the one who had left for the war and never returned to the family homestead, the one who had chosen ambition over kinship, which made her, by blood, if not by name, his niece. For a moment, she considered revealing herself, claiming the connection that might offer protection through family loyalty, but looking into James Blackwood's cold eyes, she knew there would be no protection there, only exploitation of a different kind. He had not recognized her, had likely never even known his brother had a daughter, and that anonymity was her advantage. Everyone in Riverbend knew John Blackwood, she said instead, a good man, an honest one. Something like irritation crossed the colonel's face at the implied comparison. Yes, well, my brother always was the simple one, content with little. He replaced his hat, his manner shifting from false courtesy to business. Now then, Miss Thorne, Adelaide supplied, using her mother's maiden name. Adelaide Thorne. Miss Thorne, as it happens, your situation presents an opportunity. The Territorial Improvement Company has need of this particular plot. Given its access to the water supply, we're prepared to offer you fair compensation for your claim, enough to set yourself up somewhere more suitable for a lady of your evident refinement. The insult wrapped in flattery was so transparent, Adelaide might have laughed under different circumstances. This land isn't for sale, Colonel, she said firmly, and the water isn't mine to sell. It flows for all. The colonel's expression hardened, the pretense of civility falling away. Perhaps I'm not making myself clear, Miss Thorne. This isn't really a request. The territorial governor has granted our company certain rights for development. Your claim, while admirable for a woman of your independent spirit, is ultimately inconvenient to progress. Your version of progress, Adelaide countered, her hand inching closer to her knife. Seems to me true progress would respect what's already here, not trample it for profit. The men flanking Blackwood shifted, hands drifting toward their weapons. Tension crystallized in the air between them, sharp enough to cut. Behind her, Adelaide knew Akacheta was watching, waiting for the moment when observation became action. I'd advise you to reconsider, Miss Thorne, Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a tone that had likely intimidated many before her. A woman alone faces many dangers on the frontier. Accidents happen, fires start. It would be a shame if some misfortune were to befall you out here with no one to come to your aid. The threat hung in the air, blatant in its implication. Adelaide felt a surge of cold anger, not just at the intimidation, but at the casual cruelty of a man who would threaten his own niece, unknown to him though she was, for a plot of land and a creek. I'm not alone, Colonel, she said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest, and I'm not afraid of men who hide their greed behind talk of progress. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You'd do well to fear a little more, Miss Thorne. We return tomorrow. Have your belongings packed and be ready to depart, or we'll consider your claim abandoned and proceed accordingly. He touched the brim of his hat in mocking farewell. Good day, as the three men turned their horses, rejoining the larger group that waited at a distance. Adelaide remained on her porch, outwardly calm while her mind raced. That they would return was certain. That they intended to force her from her land, or worse, was equally clear. The only question was when and how the confrontation would unfold. Once the riders were well away, heading toward the south where the creek widened into a natural camping spot, Akacheta emerged from his hiding place. His expression was grim. bad man," he said simply. "Has darkness in eyes." Adelaide nodded, still processing the shock of discovering her blood connection to the threat they faced. "They'll be back, probably at dawn, thinking to catch us unprepared." Maka and Hanska joined them, having heard everything from their concealed positions. Maka spat into the dust. "Not soldiers," he said dismissively. "Just men with guns. Think it makes them strong." "It makes them dangerous," Adelaide corrected. "They don't need to be skilled if they outnumber us 4-1. Akecheta studied her face, a strange combination of battle readiness and perception in his own. "You know this man," he said, not a question, but a statement. "Before today." Adelaide hesitated, then decided truth was necessary among those who would risk their lives beside her. "He's my father's brother," she admitted. "My uncle by blood, though he doesn't recognize me. We never met before today. My father refused to speak of him, except to say he chose money over family." The three warriors exchanged glances laden with significance. Among the Lakota, family bonds were sacred, kinship the foundation of society. A man who would threaten his own blood, even unknowingly, represented a particular kind of corruption. "Changes nothing," Hanska said in halting English, surprising Adelaide, who had never heard him speak her language before. "Blood that denies blood is no blood." They spent the remainder of the day in focused preparation, knowing that despite Blackwood's stated timeline, an earlier attack was possible. Additional caltrops were fashioned and placed. Firing positions were established with clear lines of sight to all approaches. Inside the cabin, Adelaide prepared bandages and medicines, hoping they wouldn't be needed but too practical to ignore the possibility. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the prairie, Maka approached, Adelaide with something wrapped in a square of soft leather. "For protection," he said, unfolding the bundle to reveal a vest of hardened leather reinforced with bone plates, lightweight but capable of turning a glancing bullet or absorbing the impact of a knife. "Lakota armor," he explained, holding it, "up for her inspection. Made for my son. He walks with ancestors now. You wear." The gift was intensely personal, a father's protection for a fallen son now offered to her. Adelaide accepted it with the solemnity it deserved, understanding that more than physical protection was being offered. It was acceptance, recognition, a symbolic adoption into their circle of mutual defense. "Thank you," she said, slipping the vest on over her shirt. It fit reasonably well, snug but not restricting. "I'll honor it." As evening settled over the prairie, they gathered once more around a small shielded fire. The mood was solemn, but not despairing, each lost in their own thoughts, yet united in purpose. Tomorrow would bring violence, that much was certain. What remained in question was who would still be standing when it ended. "What will you do?" Akecheta asked, as the fire burned low. "After." Adelaide looked up, surprised by the question that assumed survival, that looked beyond the immediate danger to what might come next. "I don't know," she admitted. "Stay, if I can. Rebuild what gets broken." "Alone?" Maka asked, his scarred face thoughtful in the flickering light. Adelaide touched the spiral amulet at her throat, thinking of Hotar's words, of Chaitan's promise to return if she wished it. "Maybe not," she said softly. "Maybe not alone anymore." As night deepened, they took up their positions. Hanska on first watch, Akecheta and Maka resting but ready, Adelaide in the cabin with the door barred and rifle loaded. Through the small window, she watched the stars wheel overhead, countless and indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath them. She thought of her father, of what he would say if he could see her now, preparing to defend her home alongside Lakota warriors, against men led by his own brother. John Thorne had been a practical man, but also one of principle. He had taught her to fight when necessary, but never to seek violence, to stand her ground, but know when ground wasn't worth dying for. Was this land, this creek, this solitary existence worth the blood that might be shed tomorrow? Adelaide didn't know, but she did know that if she yielded to threats, if she allowed fear to drive her decisions, something essential would be lost. Not just a homestead, but the self-respect that had sustained her through years of judgment and exclusion. In the darkest hour before dawn, Adelaide rose from her restless sleep, checked her weapons one final time, and stepped onto her porch. Akecheta materialized from the shadows, his expression tense. "They move," he said quietly. "Breaking camp now, many with guns ready." Adelaide nodded, unsurprised. "Earlier than they said, hoping to catch us unprepared." "We ready," Akecheta assured, her a fierce pride in his voice. "They find no sleeping woman, they find warriors." As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Adelaide stood on her porch, rifle in hand, watching the approach of men who thought her easy prey. Behind and beside her, 3 Lakota warriors waited in strategic positions, weapons ready, spirits prepared. They had come for her land, for the water that sustained it, for the right to determine who belonged and who did not. They would find instead a woman who had found her place, not despite her differences, but because of them. A woman who stood between worlds, who had been ostracized for her strength, only to find that strength valued by those she had been taught to fear. Adelaide chambered a round in her rifle, the metallic click a promise in the morning stillness. The spiral stone felt warm against her skin, despite the cool dawn air. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, undiminished, unafraid, and no longer alone. The first bullet splintered the porch railing inches from Adelaide's shoulder, sending wooden shards flying like angry wasps. She didn't flinch. Her father had taught her that hesitation in a firefight was often fatal. Instead, she dropped to one knee, using the porch as cover, and sighted along her rifle at the approaching riders. Colonel Blackwood and his men had abandoned any pretense of negotiation. They had appeared on the horizon just as dawn broke, riding hard toward the cabin in a spreading formation designed to surround and overwhelm. When they were within range, the first shot had come without warning, a declaration of intent more eloquent than any words. Adelaide drew a steady breath and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet found its mark, striking the shoulder of a rider on the left flank. Not a killing shot. She wasn't ready to cross that line unless absolutely necessary, but enough to unseat him, sending him tumbling into the prairie grass with a cry of pain and surprise. The battle erupted in earnest then. From his position near the creek, Maka fired with deadly precision, his ancient rifle speaking with authority. One of Blackwood's men fell from his saddle, clutching his chest. Another's horse reared in panic as Hanska's arrow whispered through the morning air and found its mark in the animal's flank, throwing its rider to the ground. "Circle right!" Blackwood shouted, his voice carrying across the homestead. "Flank the cabin!" 3 riders broke from the main group, spurring their horses toward the western edge of Adelaide's property. They never made it. Hidden in the tall grass, the caltrops did their work, piercing hooves and boots alike. One horse went down hard, pinning its rider beneath its thrashing weight. The others lost momentum, becoming stationary targets for Akecheta's swift arrows. The exchange of fire continued, bullets thudding into wood and earth, the crack of rifles punctuated by shouts and the frightened whinnying of horses. Adelaide reloaded with practiced hands, her mind clear despite the chaos. This was no longer about land or water or even survival. It had become a test of wills, of who would break first when faced with the reality of blood and pain. Through the gunsmoke, Adelaide caught glimpses of Blackwood, directing his men from behind their line, his face contorted with frustrated rage. He hadn't expected resistance, certainly not coordinated and effective resistance. The easy seizure of a woman's homestead had become a costly assault against determined defenders. "The shed!" Adelaide called to Akacheta, who had worked his way closer to the cabin. "They're trying to reach it for cover." Akacheta nodded once, understanding instantly. He loosed an arrow toward the small structure where Adelaide stored tools and dry goods, the projectile trailing a strip of oil-soaked cloth that ignited as it flew. The arrow struck the shed's wooden wall, flames blossoming immediately around the point of impact. The message was clear. There would be no cover, no refuge, no easy victory here. Blackwood's men hesitated, caught in the open with dwindling options. "Enough!" Blackwood's voice cut through the gunfire, edged with authority and desperation. "Miss Thorne, this is madness. You're outnumbered. Surrender now, and I give you my word no harm will come to you." Adelaide didn't respond immediately. Instead, she caught Marka's eye across the yard and nodded once, a signal they had agreed upon earlier. The older warrior slipped away from his position, circling behind the cottonwoods to approach Blackwood's position from an unexpected angle. "Your word means nothing, Colonel," Adelaide called back, keeping his attention focused on her. "A man who threatens a woman's home has no honor to swear by." "Damn your stubbornness, woman." Blackwood's composure cracked further. "This land was never meant for the likes of you. It's worth more than you could possibly understand." "I understand." "Enough," Adelaide replied, reloading her rifle with deliberate movements. "I understand you'd kill for profit. I understand you'd threaten your own blood for gain." A momentary silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning shed and the groans of the wounded. "What did you say?" Blackwood's voice had changed, confusion threading through the anger. Adelaide stood, keeping her rifle ready, but exposing herself enough to be clearly seen. The bone-plated vest Marka had given her caught the morning light, its unusual appearance drawing every eye. "John Thorne was my father, Colonel, your brother, which makes me your niece, though I'm grateful he never burdened me with the Blackwood name." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Blackwood's face drained of color, visible even at this distance. "Impossible," he said, but without conviction. "John never had children." "He had me," Adelaide said simply. "Raised me alone after my mother died. Taught me everything a person needs to know to survive in this world, including how to recognize men who mistake cruelty for strength." The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. In the silence, Adelaide was acutely aware of everything: the weight of her rifle, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the labored breathing of a wounded man nearby, the presence of her Lakota allies poised and watchful around the perimeter. Then, from the northern ridge, a new sound emerged. Hoofbeats, many of them approaching fast. Adelaide's heart sank. Reinforcements for Blackwood would tip the scales decisively against them, no matter how well they had fought thus far. But it wasn't Blackwood's men who appeared on the horizon. Silhouetted against the rising sun were 24 riders on paint. Ponies, their hair flowing free, their weapons gleaming. At their center rode a familiar figure, Hotar, the silver streaks in his braids catching the light like polished metal. And beside him, tall and straight in his saddle despite his injury, was Chaitin. They rode without hurry, but with undeniable purpose, forming a crescent as they approached. Blackwood's men shifted nervously, recognizing the tactical disadvantage that had suddenly befallen them. Caught between Adelaide's defended position and a force of Lakota warriors, their options had narrowed dramatically. "Colonel!" one of his men called, voice tight with tension. "Orders?" Blackwood didn't answer immediately, his gaze locked on Adelaide, something unreadable in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or possibly regret. Then he straightened in his saddle, the mask of command slipping back into place. "Hold your fire," he ordered. "All of you." The approaching Lakota slowed as they neared, maintaining a disciplined formation. Hotar raised his hand, and his warriors halted, creating a living boundary that enclosed the battleground in a semicircle of watchful eyes and ready weapons. Chaitin separated from the group, riding forward until he was midway between the two factions. He sat his horse with the fluid ease of someone born to the saddle, his wounded arm now free of its sling, though still held carefully against his body. "This woman is under our protection," he called, his voice carrying across the contested ground. "Those who threaten her threaten the Lakota." Blackwood's jaw tightened, calculation visible in his eyes as he assessed the new balance of power. "This is a private dispute over legally claimed territory," he said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "The Indian agent at Fort Reynolds will not help you here," Chaitin interrupted. "This land was promised to us in the treaty. Your government broke last winter. You build where you have no right to build. You take what was never yours to take." Adelaide watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment, as if observing from outside herself. The collision of worlds she had inadvertently precipitated by helping a wounded man had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined. Her small homestead had become a flashpoint, a symbol of larger conflicts that had simmered beneath the surface of the territory for generations. "We have no quarrel with your people today," Blackwood said, his tone shifting to cautious diplomacy. "Our business is with the woman and her claim. Her claim is recognized by us," Chaitin replied. "And we have not forgotten that she saved the life of the chief's nephew when others would have let him die." He looked directly at Adelaide then, a world of meaning in his dark eyes. "Debts of life are sacred." The standoff continued, brittle as ice in spring thaw. The wounded among Blackwood's men stirred restlessly, needing attention. The burning shed had collapsed into glowing embers. And still, the two groups remained poised on the edge of renewed violence, neither willing to yield. What they believed was rightfully theirs. It was Hotar who broke the impasse. He rode forward to join his nephew, his bearing regal despite the simplicity of his attire. When he spoke, it was in clear English meant for all to hear. "There has been blood," he said, gesturing to the wounded men. "Enough for today." He turned to Blackwood, his gaze level and unflinching. "You seek water. There is water enough if shared, if respected." Blackwood's expression was skeptical. "What are you proposing?" "A boundary," Hotar said simply. "Draw the line at the lightning-struck oak. South of that you may build. North remains with the woman and her protectors. The creek flows for all." Adelaide recognized the tree he mentioned, a massive oak split by lightning years ago that stood near where her property met the open prairie. It was a fair division, one that would leave her with her cabin and garden while allowing the company access to the water they sought downstream. "And if I refuse?" Blackwood asked, though the question lacked conviction. Hotar's expression didn't change. "Then more blood, today, tomorrow, until one side has no more to give." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Is water worth so many lives, Colonel?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Adelaide watched her uncle's face as he wrestled with pride, ambition, practicality, and perhaps a flicker of conscience awakened by finding family he never knew existed. Finally, Blackwood nodded, decision made. "The lightning oak," he agreed. "But I'll have it in writing, witnessed and registered at the territorial office." "It will be done," Hotar confirmed. "Today we tend wounds, tomorrow we mark boundaries, then peace, if your word holds true." The tension that had held the moment in suspension began to dissolve, like mist under the strengthening sun. Blackwood's men relaxed marginally, lowering weapons, attending to their injured. The Lakota maintained their positions, watchful but no longer poised for immediate action. Adelaide descended from her porch, rifle still in hand, but held at her side rather than ready to fire. She approached the center of what had been their battlefield, where Chaitan and Hotar waited. Blackwood, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. Dismounting with the stiffness of a man who had spent too many hours in the saddle, they met on contested ground that was rapidly becoming shared ground, 4 individuals whose actions would resonate beyond this moment, this place. "John's daughter," Blackwood said, studying Adelaide's face with new attention. "I see him in you now, the same stubborn chin, the same eyes that never learned to look away." "I'm told I have his aim as well," Adelaide replied, not quite a threat, but a reminder of what had transpired. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's weathered face. "That you do." He glanced at the Lakota leaders, then back to his niece. "You've made strange allies, girl. Better allies than enemies," she said. "Something you might consider." Hotar dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man, stepping between them like a living boundary stone. "Blood calls to blood," he said, looking from Adelaide to Blackwood. "Even when divided by choices, this is good medicine for the land. Family finding family again." Blackwood shook his head slightly. "We're hardly family." She made her choice clear enough. "I chose to defend what's mine," Adelaide countered, "just as you would have. The difference is, I was willing to share from the beginning." Something shifted. In Blackwood's expression, not quite remorse, but perhaps recognition. "Your father and we saw the world differently. Always did. He wanted enough, I wanted more." He looked around at the homestead, the cabin, the garden Adelaide had coaxed from the prairie soil. "He would be proud of what you've built here." The words struck deeper than Adelaide had expected, touching a place of longing she usually kept, carefully guarded. Approval from her father's brother shouldn't have mattered, and yet somehow it did. Not for her sake, but for the connection to the man they had both loved in their different ways. "The boundary at the Lightning Oak stands," Blackwood said, his tone shifting to the practical. "I'll have my men withdraw to make camp there. We'll draw up the agreement tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Adelaide called after him. "Colonel," he paused, looking back. "There's a stream that feeds into the creek from the north. Better water, clearer. Might serve your needs without disturbing what I've established here." It was an olive branch, small but significant. Blackwood studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. "I'll look into it." He hesitated, then added, "Your father once offered me help when I needed it most. I refused out of pride. Perhaps that was a mistake." With that he returned to his men, issuing orders in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to command. Gradually, they gathered their wounded and withdrew toward the Lightning Oak, leaving behind spent cartridges and blood-stained earth as mute testimony to what had transpired. As they disappeared from view, Adelaide felt the tension she had been carrying begin to uncoil. Her hands trembled slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, the delayed reaction of a body that had been prepared for death and found life instead. "You came back," she said to Chaitan, her voice steadier than she felt. His eyes held hers, dark and fathomless. "I said I would." "Not all men keep their word," she observed. "I am not all men," he replied simply. Hotar surveyed the homestead, the bullet-scarred cabin, the smouldering remains of the shed, the signs of battle still evident in trampled grass, and scattered weapons. "You fought well," he said to Adelaide, "as a Lakota woman would fight, with heart and head together." The approval in his voice was unmistakable, and Adelaide felt a curious warmth spread through her chest. All her life, her strength had been treated as a liability, her independence as a flaw to be corrected. Here, among those she had been taught to fear, those very qualities were valued, respected, even admired. "What happens now?" she asked, looking from Hotar to Chaitan, then to the warriors who still maintained their protective circle around her property. "Now we rebuild what was broken," Hotar said. "Mark boundaries that respect the needs of all. Find ways to live side by side without bloodshed." His weathered face creased in a rare smile. It begins with shared food, shared fire. The rest follows. That evening, as twilight gathered over the prairie, Adelaide's homestead hosted an unlikely gathering. Lakota warriors and a handful of Blackwood's men, those who had chosen to accept the invitation, sat together around fires that illuminated faces still wary, but no longer hostile. They shared venison provided by Maka's hunting skill and coffee from Adelaide's dwindling stores, speaking little but listening much. On the porch, Adelaide sat with Chayton, Hotar, and, surprisingly, Colonel Blackwood. The unlikely council discussed boundaries, water rights, and the practicalities of coexistence with the frankness of those who had seen what the alternative could cost. Your company can still prosper with the southern access, Adelaide pointed out, tracing the proposed boundary on a rough map Blackwood had provided. The northern tributary I mentioned is reliable even in drought years. My father used to say, it came from a spring so deep the earth's heart fed it directly. Blackwood studied the map, nodding slowly. It could work, he acknowledged, though the board of directors will need convincing. Tell them the alternative is constant conflict with the Lakota, Chayton suggested, his voice neutral, but the implication clear. And with a niece who shoots as well as she negotiates, a reluctant smile touched Blackwood's lips. They've already had a taste of that medicine today. He rolled up the map decisively. I'll make them see reason. As the night deepened and the fires burned lower, the gathering gradually dispersed. Blackwood and his remaining men departed for their camp near the Lightning Oak. Most of the Lakota withdrew to their own campsite near the creek, leaving only Hotar, Chayton, and the three warriors who had stood with Adelaide through the battle. Tomorrow we draw the line, Hotar said as he prepared to join his people, but some lines are already being crossed. His gaze moved between Adelaide and Chayton, perceptive and knowing. This is also good medicine. After he departed, Adelaide and Chayton remained on the porch, watching the moon rise over the prairie. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Will you go with them? Adelaide asked finally. When they return, to the winter camp, Chayton considered the question, his profile sharp against the night sky. I walk between worlds, he said, echoing Hotar's earlier description. The white man's school taught me their language, their ways of thinking. My people taught me who I truly am. He turned to face her directly. Perhaps there is value in standing at the boundary, in being able to translate one world to another. Adelaide nodded, understanding completely. All her life she had existed at the edges, too bold for Riverbend's expectations of womanhood, too white for easy acceptance among the Lakota, too independent for the settled life others had prescribed for her. That boundary existence, once lonely, now seemed like a position of unique possibility. Hotar offered me a place among your people, she said quietly, if I wished it. Chayton's gaze was steady. And do you wish it? Adelaide looked out over her homestead, the cabin she had built with her own hands, the garden coaxed from resistant soil, the fence lines that defined but did not confine her world. I belong here, she said finally, but perhaps not only here. A smile touched Chayton's lips, genuine and warm. Then we are both between worlds, he said, neither fully in one nor the other. Is that enough? Adelaide asked. To belong? Impartially to both, but completely to neither. Chayton reached out slowly, his fingers finding hers in the darkness. The contact was brief but electric, a current passing between them that needed no words to interpret. Perhaps it is not about belonging to a world, he said softly, but about creating one where we both can exist as we truly are. The idea unfurled in Adelaide's mind like a map to unexplored territory. Not Lakota land, not white settlement, but something new. A shared space where strength was valued regardless of gender, where different ways of seeing could exist side by side, where the spiral symbol she still wore at her throat could represent not division, but connection. Dawn found Adelaide standing at the lightning oak, watching as Hotar and Blackwood formalized their agreement. The boundary line was marked with stones placed at regular intervals, a physical representation of the understanding they had reached. It was not perfect, boundaries seldom are, but it was a beginning, a recognition that conflict was not the only possible relationship between different worlds. As the men shook hands, sealing their agreement, Adelaide felt Chaitan's presence beside her, solid and reassuring. Before them stretched the prairie, vast and full of possibility. Behind them lay choices made and unmade, the consequences of helping a wounded stranger that had rippled outward to touch lives beyond counting. "What now?" Chaitan asked quietly, his shoulder almost but not quite touching hers. Adelaide smiled, facing the future with the same direct gaze that had once scandalized Riverbend society. "Now we build something new," she said, "something between." And in that moment, standing between worlds with a man who understood what it meant to exist at the boundary, Adelaide Thorne realized she had found something she had never expected, not just acceptance, not just respect, but the possibility of belonging on her own terms, undiminished and unafraid. The spiral stone at her throat caught the morning light, its ancient pattern a reminder that circles can expand, that boundaries can be crossroads rather than barriers, that what makes us different can also be what makes us essential to the new world waiting to be born. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.